Hey guys, Nick here and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be jumping into Davinci Resolve and going through every single option there is in the text node inside of Fusion. I get asked to do like deep dives like this quite a fair bit, so that's what we're doing today. It's going to be a fairly long video, but if you ever wanted to figure out everything there is to know about the text node and all the cool different effects you can achieve, this is the video for you. You're probably going to want something to snack on, something to drink, because it is a bit of a long one. We're going through every single option there is. And I think this is like the only video on YouTube to do that. So let's jump in. All right guys, here we are in Davinci Resolve. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just quickly chuck down a Fusion composition and we're gonna jump into Fusion. All right, so because we're taking a look at the text node, I'm going to just drag one down, boop, and we're gonna connect it across. And just quickly in the inspector, which I'm gonna drop all the way down so we can have a good look at, is I'm just gonna type in a few things. So all right, and the reason I want a few lines is just so we can play around with it. So we don't really need the node section. So we're going to do, all right, so now we're ready to take a look at the text node. So we're gonna start in the inspector and we're gonna start in the text tab and we're gonna go top to bottom and then we're gonna go across all the different options. So starting off the global in and out, this is going to be on pretty much every node there is, and that just controls pretty much what frame it starts at. So if we go here, 32, that's where that text starts at 0. Pretty simple and straightforward there. A quick thing to note as well is if you don't have a background in your scene, which is just created by dragging the background node in, the text node is going to take on the default size of whatever your project is, which is set up in the timeline format here. So 1920 by 1080. So just so you're aware. So moving down, so obviously we have our styled text box. This is where we can type in our text and we can do as many different layers as we want, hitting enter. We can also do tabs to add things to the side there. Pretty self-explanatory. Moving down from there, like a lot of these things are gonna be pretty basic for you guys. So we got our font. So if we change the font there, let's go to one of the ones I like to use a fair bit, which is this one. So we can change that, and then we obviously have the font type, whether we want it to be bold italic, we want it to be sort of like a half bold. Again, pretty standard sort of stuff. We're gonna go from medium italic. All right, moving down from that, we have our color option. We can do just a basic color change here. We can also do that a bit further over here in the shading parameter. So we're just gonna leave it at white at the moment. Moving down from there, we have our size option, and that's going to increase the size of the text. If at any point you want to reset it, you can double click the size or the label or the dot here, which will reset it back to the position it was at. And that's going to be for any slider, either double click here or hit that little dot there. Now, if you find the slider is a bit too sort of fiddly, you can also just click in the box here. You can either enter a value by double clicking and hitting 5, and that's obviously going to be way too big, or you can just click and drag in that box, and that's going to slowly increase the size, and you're going to have a lot more control. And you can see here, if I move the slider, it moves really quite a fair bit in terms of the numbers. But then if I click and drag in here, it's actually changing it 4 decimal spots to the side. So you're getting really precise controls over your sizing. All right, next one down is tracking. That controls the space between each letter. So again, we can either make it, can have the tracking quite high, or we can have it in quite low. Perfect. Next is the line spacing. That is the gap in between however many lines you have. So if we increase that, we can have more space. We can obviously bring it in nice and tight. And that's going to apply for whatever lines, however many lines you have in your text. So I'm just going to increase the tracking just a little bit more. Now, the next one, we have our V anchor. This is basically going to be our vertical or our y-axis for the pivot point, this being the pivot point here, so where we move it. It's not a huge deal when it comes to text, but if I do to the top, you're going to notice that it puts the anchor to the top of the text and then it moves it. This can be interesting by the size, because the size is going to scale based off of this point. So if I zoom in, you can notice now that it's coming in from that point, as opposed to if I was to put it in the center. And now it scales in from the center or from the bottom. So you can see here that that's how it kind of affects it. By default, it's always in the center, and you can have it to the left, and then again, it's going to scale into the left, and you can have it to the top. So you can have some really interesting ways to control it. And that's just a really interesting way to be able to sort of format your text, you know, depending on how you want to have it animate or have it, I guess, scale in and scale out. By default, it is from the center. Now the V anchor control is another way to do it. So we either have our two options. So we have above, below, in the middle, left, right, in the middle, and then we have a slider. Okay, so we can slide to the top, slide to the bottom, or have it anywhere in between. Then we have our vertical justifier and H justifier, so vertical, horizontal. I haven't been able to figure out what they do. I've played around with it as much as I can. It's not doing anything, so let's just leave that. Awesome. So next we have our direction. So this is going to be the word direction. So we have automatic, so left to right, which is what automatic is, or we can flip it and have it right to left if you want. We can have it top down, which gives us this, and then we can have bottom up. So even, I don't know, if you have an idea of how you'd want to use it, there you go. That's what that's for. And then we have our line direction, which again is going to be something similar. So we've got top down, or we can flip it upside down and have testing, you know. Again, it's cool that it's there because at least you can control it after the fact, but again, you'd probably just type that out to start with. And then we have our underline option as well as our strike through option there. So just little additions there. The next thing we have is our right on and right off. So if we move it across, you can see it animates on and off. And if we go backwards, it goes back the next way. Now with everything we've just talked about here, they all have a diamond next to it, which means they are all animatable. So if we were to move forward and say animate the right on, we can click that, move forward, move that slider. And now if we play that through, you can see that it animates on. So all of these are animatable. So that will give you a lot of control with, you know, coming up with some interesting options. If we go down to our advanced controls, we have our monospace, and this is going to control the spacing in between the letters. So what we're going to do is I'm going to move that slider. You can see it brings the letters nice and close together. And so that's what that controls there. Next, we have our tab spacing. So the tab spacing controls the effect of what hitting the tab key will do if we were to type. So if I go down to the next page, hit tab, obviously it tabs in a little bit, and type in test. We can go down here and under tab 1, so if we hit the tab key once, we can now control the position. So we can have it so that it comes over here, and we can move the alignment a little bit so that the next time, even though in the box it has that, if I go tab and start typing, it comes over to the left-hand side. Now what we can do is go to tab 2. So if I was to do space and go tab, and then type in test, we can control where tab 2 positions. And then you can see here, we've got a few different interesting effects. This is really good, say if you're gonna be doing a credit sequence and you wanna type this out in a document beforehand and do tab to sort of format it properly. That is where this is going to come in really handy after the fact. All right, moving on to the next one. This is the layout tab. Some really interesting things here. So we're gonna actually start at the bottom because it's the most simplest. And this is the background. So we don't actually have to use a background node if we don't want to. We can just use the color picker here. By default, it's kind of semi-transparent. We can just drag this slider on the right-hand side. That's going to change the opacity here, which is controlled by the alpha option. So, and in this instance, black is fully transparent. So we're gonna have black, we're just gonna leave it transparent. Rotation is pretty self-explanatory. It's gonna control the rotation of the text depending on the different axes. All right, so the layout one is a little bit different and quite complicated, but you can do some really cool effects with it. So perspective is probably not gonna change too much because it's a 2D object, but that basically will change the way it is interpreted by this default camera. Size, pretty self-explanatory, we're already talking about it. Now, at any point, if you find the slider goes all the way to the right and you can't increase it, you can just double click in that box, add 10, it's going to change the size of that slider and we can bring it right back down. Z center Z is basically faking 3D, I guess. Z being your depth axis in 3D. It obviously looks like it's just scaling in and out. It isn't actually, and this is a cool way to sort of, I guess, get a 3D animation effect, have it come towards the camera without it actually being a 3D text layer. Now the center X and Y is basically controlling where this point here, the center point, is in the screen. So moving it to the X is going to be your horizontal, moving it to the Y is going to be your vertical. And because you can animate it, that's where you probably control your positioning. Next, we have this point, frame, and circle. This is going to control how the text is, I guess, typed out. If it's typed out as a point, it's going to just come out from one side. If we change it to a circle, it's going to go around in a circle, and we're going to get a lot of different options here. So we can change the width of the circle and get some really cool effects there. And we can adjust the spacing a little bit so that we can adjust it to fit, or we can have no spacing so that the text kind of overlaps each other. We can move it to the left and right again still, have it come in and out. Let's move it down a little bit. So it's really interesting how this kind of works. Width is going to control, I guess, how far it wraps around that circle. So you can get some really cool effects. Path is another really cool one. So you can actually type a little path out, and like, what's cool about having a path is the fact you get this option to position it on the path. So you can actually have it here, set a keyframe, move forward a little bit, move along the path, and now you can have your text animate along the path. Really, really, really cool. And then you have frame, where it's kind of just in a box, and this is where you can control a bit more perspective, height, and that sort of stuff there. Honestly, you're probably going to find yourself using point more often than not. And circle, which can obviously give you some cool effects as well. And I find path can be a really cool way to animate as well. Obviously this looks pretty cool. So that is the layout option there. Moving on to the next, so let's just reset this. We have our transform tab. So this is going to be, again, like you find a lot of these things are repeated. So we have our spacing or our tracking, and this is doing it on a character basis. We can do it so that the spacing is done on a word basis. So that's kind of cool. And we can do it based off of the line. So as you can see, we're sort of controlling the same things that you can control here. So we have our line tracking and all that sort of stuff. So that's just all over here. And then obviously this is all animatable as well. And then you have your rotation down here, which is obviously going to rotate your text. Got your size separately, and you can size to the Y if you really want to do some really interesting stretching options. And to the X, I'm just going to reset that. And then we also have our shear. Shear is basically stretching like the bottom one way and the top the other way. So if we do it along X, you can see it kind of does that. And then we've got that one as well. So we can do some really cool effects that way. Moving on to the next one, which is our shading tab. So this is where we're going to really control the look of the text. So for this to look really cool, I'm just going to change it to bold so we've got a bit more to play with. So we're going to look at the shading elements section, not quite at the start. We're going to look here in the properties. So this is where we can change the color of it. And currently you can see where we've got it to text fill, but if we wanted it, we could be text outline. There you go, you get the text outline. We could also change it to a border fill. It's not going to really work in this particular instance just because of the type of text we're using, because it's that we're using letters, so it doesn't really work that well. But you can see we've got different options here for the text color. We can change the way it blends, so we can have it transparent. And this is going to affect how it applies to the bottom, so the layer beneath it. We also can change it from a solid, which is going to be a color, to a gradient, where we can actually change the backup color. So we can, let's do something like this, change the color there, and then we can click on this one and change it to another color, and we can get some cool little gradient effects going on. Let's change that one to something like that. So we've got a bit of a gradient, and further down we can change just how the gradient reacts. So currently it's doing like top to bottom. By doing the mapping angle, we can rotate where that gradient, we need a more distinct kind of color. Yeah, here we go. We can control where that gradient kind of comes from, and sort of how, I guess, what the difference is in terms of moving, it's basically controlling that. So that's kind of cool. And then again, we can change it to be as per the line, or we can do character or word as before. We also have softness, which is going to sort of blur it because we're controlling the color of the whole text. So that's going to blur it. This is also where we have a inbuilt glow option. And although we do have glow effects built into Fusion, we can control it independently here as well. So that's kind of cool. But you can notice here that by increasing it to 1, that's because you need to have the softness built just a little bit first. And then you have your blend, which is basically going to control how the softness reacts to the original text. So having it at 1 means that you're going to see the effects. Having it at 0 means you're not going to see the effects here. So let's actually increase that so it's a bit more extreme. Super, super blurry. And then we bring the blend down. There you go. And then moving further down, we have the position and rotation, shear and size. This is where we're going to go into it because at the moment we just have one shading layer, and so it's just rotating the text. Doesn't look very good, but if we were to go right at the top, you can see we have shading elements. Currently we have 1 element, okay? If we hit that drop down box, we can go to shading element 2. Next to it, the check mark is not enabled. If we enable this, all of a sudden it adds a new element to our text, which is a red outline, but it doesn't have to be an outline. We can make it whatever we want. So obviously by default is an outline. So let's just do a black text. We can increase the thickness of this outline and all that sort of stuff there. We can also control the position and the softness of this separately. So if we wanted to rotate the outline, now we have the rotation of the outline separate. So it looks kind of cool like that. Where this comes in really handy is if we want to add another element. So let's add a third element. Now it's a shadow. So that's just by default, that's what it's giving us. So we can do like a red shadow. It's a bit softer by default. We can give it a bit of a glow if we want to. And then we can rotate it fully down. So we can let's rotate it on the horizontal. And then we're going to do a bit of a shear on it. So we're going to do that. So you can see we can start to get some really cool effects coming out by playing around with different shading levels. So let's do that, looks kind of cool. Something really interesting going on there. I don't quite know what. One more thing I want to show you here in the shading elements is if we go, you can always go back through the shading elements. So if you want to change the outline to whatever you want it to be, you can always go back, right? But let's go back to this original color, all right? So currently we've got it set to a gradient. You might have noticed we have an image option. So let's select that. All of a sudden we've got a few more options available. And this is where we can actually add an image instead of a color. So what we're gonna do is, you can see here we got image source. So we can have it as a tool, which is where we'd have it as a media in node, or we can change it to a clip. And that allows us to browse our hard drive for an image. So if I go to downloads and let's just get like a random image of a castle and open it, now we have that castle image as basically our material, and we can change how it sort of does the edges if that's how we want it. So we can wrap it around and you can see it sort of like duplicating, or we can duplicate it where we get some weird effects here. So that's another way to do it there, depending on how you want to do it, but it's a cool option to have. And what's really cool as well is that if you change to gradient, it remembers your last options, so you don't have to worry about fiddling around with them. All right, moving on to the next one. This is where we have basically the image controls of the frame. Like I said at the start, because you don't have a background node in here, it just takes on the parameters of your project settings, 1920 by 1080. We can see that here, 1920, 1080. You don't really need to play around with this. This is just fine as is. And the next one is just the settings node. This is going to be the same for every node that you have. So if I was to say drag a background node down and we go to the settings, you can see that the options here are more or less the exact same. We have motion blur so that if we were to animate it, so if we were to go, let's go down to this one, we're going to do path where we have it animated. And I like how it remembers, right? So we have it animated along a path. Here we've got the motion blur added. If I go over here and uncheck motion blur, you can see it turns off. So that's a kind of cool one. You can increase the quality of the motion blur, give it a sec to bake in. So that is pretty much every option that we have in the text node. I will show you one more thing that you can do with the text node, but we're starting to get into more advanced things, and that's it. What if you want to control, say, the boldness or anything like that on a per character basis? Really simple. All you're going to do is you're going to right click in the text box here, and you're going to go character level styling. That's added a modifier. All of a sudden this modify option is available. If I remove that, you can see that modify option isn't there. So we're going to go character level styling. That means we can control each individual character, letter, or anything at the letter basis. To do that, we're going to head on over to the modifier. So in the modifier with the node selected, we can click and drag over whatever we want, and we can pretty much have all the options we had before. So we can go heavy, see how it's controlling only those two. If you can see that, that's those two selected. Can select that top word. Let's change it to light or italic. There we go. And we can change that last word to heavy as well. And then it goes down to even the color, because we have more or less the same options. So we can change the opacity of like one section. We can change it to a solid color if we wanted to. You get a lot of different options, and now we've got something really kind of cool going on there. Again, I don't want to go too much into this sort of like character level editing, just simply because it can get really complicated in terms of what you can actually achieve. As you see, we pretty much have an entire new text node layout up here with all these things that we can control. So that's really, really cool. And it gives you some cool options. So hopefully that gives you some ideas. So there you go, guys. Obviously a pretty long video going through all the options. Hopefully, I don't know, you learned something you didn't already know, and you can go off and start creating some cool title effects, because that's what this video is for. So you learn the tool well enough to go off and create the effects that you want to do. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. And until the next video, see ya.